Sweets with Sophie. Today, we're going to be testing out some recipes using sourdough discard. So, the first one we're going to make is a brown butter sourdough chocolate chip cookie. And the first thing that you're going to need to do for this is to brown the butter. This recipe calls for about 225 grams of butter. So we're going to take the scale and put our pot that we're going to use to brown the butter on it. And we're going to turn it on, set it to grams, and just cut some chunks and add them to the pot until you get your 225 grams of butter. Now, it may seem like this is a lot of butter, but a lot of butter is really key if you want to get a classic chocolate chip cookie flavor. Alright, that was a little too much, so you can just cut some off, put some back in. Perfect. Alright, so now what we're going to do is take the pot with the butter and turn it up to medium heat. What browning the butter does is gives the chocolate chip cookies a nice nutty flavor, and it also releases some of the water, and that water will later be replaced with our sourdough discard. So it's very important not to skip this stuff, because if so, then your chocolate chip cookies are going to be way too soft and won't work out the same way that the recipe should. So the butter is going to start melting pretty much immediately, and you don't have to worry too much about stirring it constantly, because you want to be able to let it do its thing on the bottom and really start to caramelize and get those brown bits. While the butter is melting and browning on the stove, I'm going to measure out my dry ingredients. So here on the scale, I'm going to add 380 grams of all-purpose flour. So when you weigh your ingredients, it's going to give you a much more accurate result than if you're just measuring them out with a measuring spoon, because you can make sure that you have the exact right amount that the recipe calls for down to the gram, instead of risking having pockets of error in your flour that's not actually going to give you the proper result that you want when you're baking. Okay, almost there. Perfect. Just take a little bit out. There you go. Next, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of baking powder. And little trick, you can use the lid of your container to scrape it off so that you can make sure that you have an even measurement. Teaspoon of baking soda. Oh, my butter's starting to bubble. And also 1 teaspoon of kosher salt. It's good to use kosher salt in a recipe like chocolate chip cookies, because that way you can have the bigger chunks of salt in your cookie, which will give a nice contrast and flavor when you're eating it. So, next, going to just whisk the dry ingredients together and then set that aside as the butter browns. As you can see, the butter is starting to bubble, and it's also getting this foam on top. And that foam is a good sign. It means that your butter is going to start to brown. And at this point, you're going to want to watch it a little more carefully, because once it starts to brown, it's going to brown very quickly, and you don't want it to burn. Now, if you see, the butter is starting to get golden on top. You can see the color coming through. So what you're going to want to do is just give it a good stir and try to see close to the bottom how brown it's getting. It can be a little hard to tell. I always like to let it go a little bit longer than you think, because that'll just give extra rich flavor. You can see all these brown bits right here, this brown spot that's coming up. That's a good sign. Now the brown butter is ready to go, so we're just going to turn off the heat and then pour it into a separate container. You want to make sure that your container is fairly large, because the butter might bubble up some once you take it out. Now, all these brown bits at the bottom, you're going to want to scrape those out into the bowl, because those are what's going to give most of the brown butter the flavor. That's actually the milk solids that I've toasted to the bottom and are going to give it the nutty flavor. Here we have our brown butter that is completely cool. So now I'm just going to take the hand mixer and mix it up to bring it back together. So you can see that it is nice and brown with those little specks in it. The next thing we're going to do is take 220 grams of each white sugar and brown sugar and add it into our bowl. To add our brown sugar. The main difference between white sugar and brown sugar is that brown sugar has some molasses in it. So the molasses adds a nice rich flavor to the cookie, and it also is going to add some chewiness to it and make it so that it doesn't get as crispy but still has a nice gooey center. With the hand mixer, we're just going to mix it up until it's nice and fluffy. To our brown sugar and butter mixture, 3 egg yolks. You want just the egg yolks instead of the egg whites because the egg white has more water in it and liquid than the egg yolk does. So we need the richness that the egg yolk gives, and we need the cookies to bind together, but we don't want to add any extra liquid because we're adding the sourdough at the end. See now that everything is all mixed together. Next, what you're going to do is take your sourdough discard and add in 240 grams of it. This is going to add a nice tangy flavor to the cookies and just more depth to them all together. Plus, it helps you reduce waste of your sourdough discard. Next, we're going to mix this up with the hand mixer, so it's all nice and incorporated. To finish off the wet, we can add just a splash of vanilla. And mix that in until it is fully incorporated. We're now going to take our dry ingredients and add them into our wet. Then we're going to just slowly fold to get it to all come together. The final thing that we're going to do is add in our chocolate. So I'm going to add in some chocolate chips and some chocolate chunks. The chocolate chips are more what's kind of classic and usual in a chocolate chip cookie, but the chocolate chunks are going to give more even, dispersedness of the chocolate throughout the cookie and provide more variance in texture and add more little surprise into the cookies. So there's about 220 grams of chocolate in here, and you can add more or less given how chocolatey you like it, but I personally like to have some of the cookie itself without the chocolate, so I'm going to stick with just this much. So yeah, once you just mix it up with your spatula a little bit, then cookie dough is done. What you're going to do with it now that it's done is actually, you have to let it chill. So you're going to cover the bowl in plastic wrap and then put it in the fridge for a minimum of 4 hours. And what's going to happen in that time is all the flavors are going to mix together really nicely. So the brown butter and the brown sugar with the sourdough, the flavors are just going to intensify as they sit, and especially the sourdough, because there is the little bit of like yeastiness that's in it, and that's going to develop more and more the longer you let it sit. So here are the finished cookies. I split them all into balls, and I froze about half of them. Here we have the rest. Put 6 to a sheet with parchment paper, and then baked for about 20 minutes in an oven at 320, and then sprinkled with just a little bit of sea salt. So there you have it, chocolate chip sourdough cookies. Alright, the second sourdough recipe that we're going to be making today is some pumpkin chocolate chip sourdough muffins. So first step is to mix together all of your dry ingredients. So we're going to use some whole wheat flour, 1 cup and 1/3 of a cup, into your bowl. Alright, now we're going to take 1 teaspoon of each baking powder and baking soda. Baking powder and baking soda, and we're going to take 1 teaspoon, 2 teaspoons actually, of ground cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of pumpkin pie spice, and just a pinch of salt to balance everything out. Now you're just going to whisk the dry ingredients together and then set them aside as we move on to the wet ingredients. Next, we're going to take 2 eggs and crack them into a bowl. 1, try to do it one-handed. 2, and then we're going to take a 1/4 cup of brown sugar, add that to the eggs, and then just a splash of maple syrup, probably about a tablespoon. There, perfect. Now you're just going to take your whisk, break up the eggs a little bit, and whisk that all together. There you go. Okay, so next we're going to add in about 1 cup of our sourdough discard to a liquid measuring cup. Alright. Perfect. And then we're going to add in about 1/2 cup of milk. And then a teaspoon of vanilla. Finally, the pumpkin. We're going to be adding 1 1/2 cups of pumpkin to our recipe. This recipe doesn't use any oil because the pumpkin works as an oil substitute. So you get extra flavor along without having to add any excess oil. Here we have our dry ingredients and our 2 wet ingredients. And all you need to do is just combine it all together. So take our sugar eggs in, now our pumpkin. Put it all in the bowl. Now you can just fold until everything is nice and incorporated. The last step for these muffins is to add whatever mixings you want. I like to add some chocolate chips. So you can just sprinkle some on top of each of your muffins. And then I also like to add some of this crystallized ginger. Can add some little bits on top of a few of them. The ginger and the chocolate does go well together, but you can also add it in just separately. So we'll do a couple with both, some with just one. And then I'm also going to add some pumpkin seeds. So these pumpkin seeds are salted, but there isn't a lot of salt in the muffin. And also with the chocolate chips and the sugar on the ginger, the salt that's on them is going to help balance everything out in the end. You can just sprinkle some on each one. And then after, you can use your knife, just a butter knife, to kind of mix everything in and make sure that you have a nice even distribution of everything. If you're doing just one mix in, like only chocolate chips or only pumpkin seeds or only ginger, then you can mix in before you actually put it into the cups. But if you want to have multiple, then it's easier to just mix every single muffin individually. Alright. So once these are all mixed in, and they will go in a 425-degree oven for 12 to 18 minutes until the tops are golden brown. So here are the finished muffins. It's puffed up nicely. The sourdough gives it a little bit of an extra